At least 17 dolphins have been found dead on the coast in Mauritius. This after a huge oil spill. Last month, a Japanese tanker ran aground on a coral reef and broke into two, leaking hundreds of tons of oil into the Indian Ocean. According to the Ministry of Fisheries, the dead dolphins had several wounds and blood around their jaws, whilst the ones that survived were fatigued and could barely swim. The carcasses were currently undergoing a post-mortem. Meanwhile, Greenpeace Africa has warned that thousands of animal species are at risk of drowning in a sea of pollution, with dire consequences for Mauritius's economy, food security and health. Right, Happy Khambule is Greenpeace Africa's Senior Climate and Energy Campaign Manager, and he joins us now via Skype for more on this story. Mr. Khambule, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Such a tragedy to see these dolphins washing ashore dead. Do we know for sure that this is related to the oil spill?
Good evening to everyone. And what I must say, first of all, is that our hearts go to all those who witnessed this thing. And to be very frank, what we do know is that post the bow of the ship being sunk inside or by the ocean, what we then saw is that then the very immediate next day, the animals started floating and landing on the seashore line, and some were dead as you described, and some were actually trying to run away from something. So until the autopsy gives us the answers as what has happened rather, we're unable to verify and say exactly that it is as a result of the fuel or any of the heavy metals that were in the ship.
All right, so typically in a situation like this, we're talking dolphins, but there's more animal life and fish life at risk now.
Yes, the most immediate that we have also witnessed is sperm whales and other versions of mammals that have also been on the shoreline. But we have to also remember there's also bird life that frequents the area. There's also other versions of sea life, fish, as well as crustaceans. So until we actually do a thorough analysis and start to see some of the impacts that we are not able to conceive right now, we are actually forecasting the worst. And this is for us maybe something that is going to happen and become even more worse.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the ships themselves, because this kind of thing sadly does happen from time to time. As Greenpeace, is this something that you've been monitoring, and what can be done to make sure that we don't have these kinds of incidents as often as they do?
Well, the first thing is we need to have a thorough discourse about what was being shipped and what was being used to transport the ship, right? It was a particular kind of fuel and it was a particular kind of resource. The resource in itself was not actually going to Mauritius, so that's the first thing. And when you say that these things happen from time to time, they happen from time to time and they're becoming worse.
Mm.
This is the worst ecological disaster that has happened in the Indian Ocean and the worst that is facing Mauritius. So the first thing here is that the Mauritius coastline is subjected to something that it is not supposed to even have. The first thing that you have to also understand is that this was going from Asia, Southeast Asia, all the way to South America. So it was just passing by. And what it was passing by the island of Mauritius, and other islands also have this passage. It's called the Passage of Innocence, where anything of a ship can, or whatever is being transported by ship, passes by this particular channel and is not held by the same standards and the same rules that would be held when something passes within the lines or the confines of territorial waters. So the thing that we are calling for as Greenpeace is that you have to scrap this thing that's called an innocent passage. Nothing of that sort should be moving or being transported close to such a pristine or in any territory similar to Mauritius or even any continent. So you have to move these ships even further. But then the second thing is, to be honest, they were transporting something that wasn't necessary. The fuel that was being transported wasn't going to be used by Mauritius, but again, It's not something that is necessary because we have alternatives that will enable us to still have mobility and to power our industries outside of the fuel that they were transporting.
All right, so you're saying that these channels that exist need to be policed even more, and so that ships perhaps need a much wider berth if they're going to travel as a first instance for protection.
Yes, that's the first point of
Mm.
protection. But the fact of the matter is that the ship, this particular ship, was not even within the innocent
Mm.
passage. So it veered off that innocent passage, showing that it is possible that even if you do veer off such an innocent passage, things do tend to happen. And we are trying to still find out what actually happened when leading up to the accident. Because if you remember, the story is that there was some event and they were trying to get close to the shoreline. We're not very sure about the particulars, but at this point, the first mate and the captain have been arrested or rather detained in order to facilitate the investigation into what happened. But the ship in itself was not supposed to be that close. The
Mm.
area of innocent passage is much wider. So it basically means that in order to stop us from getting the same situation is to move it even further or rather scrap it so that the actual rules that apply in territorial waters or in some version of higher accountability and higher compliance can be applied because really the Coast Guard couldn't have done anything. Even the story that's coming from Mauritius is that the Coast Guard did hail the ship, but the ship did not respond.
Talking about accountability, I mean, what could be the possible sanction for ships and captains that do this sort of thing?
Well, the rules around navigation, safety, and navigation that would be considered. There might be issues around the license of the captain. We're unsure of what would happen in Mauritius or whether this is going to be within the territory of Panama, where the ship is actually registered, or is it going to happen in Japan? Because actually, the company that runs the ship is from Japan. Until we are able to determine rather uh, jurisdiction and who's actually going to be governing or who's going to adjudicate the matter, we are unable to say what the
Mm.
sanction is going to be. But at this point in time, the main thing that needs to happen is that insurance needs to pay out and a formula and a form of attribution of damages needs to be applied so that the communities can start to weather the storm that has come right even after COVID-19. So now they're getting a double impact. So now there has to be some version of damages that will take account of what the community is also being facing, as well as the broader macroeconomy of Mauritius.
All right, yeah, we're talking about the economy and things like that. I'm just wondering now, in terms of recovery, the coastline is damaged. How long does it take to clean up, try and sort this kind of mess out? And I guess there's probably some damage that will never be a fix.
Yeah, so because this is one of the first ones, or rather one of the first
Mm.
and largest ones that are happening along along the Indian Ocean and along Mauritius's coastline, we need to consider that when these kinds of events do happen or accidents do happen, they take quite a while. And because of the kind of biodiversity and the kinds of richness of the life and the pristineness of the area that Mauritius has, this is going to have even untold consequences, and it's very different from when it happens in another area where there isn't this kind of mix of biodiversity and the kinds of intrinsic link with the ocean and the economy as well as the people who live there. So we are yet to actually fully understand what the impacts are going to be and what the impacts are. And we didn't even think that there would be dolphins that are floating and also landing on the seashore. So we are in uncharted waters here, and the only precedent that we do have, as I said, is that there will be damages that are paid, and there will be some form of compensation that is paid for actually for
Mm.
containing it and for trying to remove what is excess. But as I'm telling you this, you can understand that because of the biodiversity and the richness of that biodiversity, we aren't sure what's really going to happen and whether or not some of these life forms are going to come back.
And counting the cost will continue and perhaps take a long time to tally. The human aspect, I would imagine fishermen and just general human activity that's associated with the coastline and the sea greatly affected here.
Indeed. There's quite a number of reports of skin irritations, of the inability to actually breathe comfortably. There is a particular stench that the communities that are in the front line of this disaster that are feeling. So the quality of life of people, even outside of the economic benefit that people were enjoying from using the ocean, has been greatly diminished. And what we are now going to start to see is that when this public eye is already gone from this and the community needs to go back to a normalcy of some kind, they'll be unable to access the waters, or rather access the resources of the waters, because they'll be depleted, and most of the life form, if it's not dead or has not been injured as we have seen, it would have already escaped. And what we are trying to ascertain, and this is what I must reiterate, is it whether it was because of the ship was sunk into the base of the ocean, or is it because of the oil spill that this has happened?
All right, so this is Mauritius, part of Africa. Are there other parts of the continent that are vulnerable to these kinds of accidents happening in the future, especially when we consider what you were talking about, channels and perhaps even relaxed regulations?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think in the context of the broader continent, we need to start to look at areas where further these where extraction of these resources such as oil and gas are happening. If you're looking at the Niger Delta, it's a very prime example of what happens when there's relaxed regulation and it's just a free for all in terms of transportation and beneficiating of the resource without proper accountability and governance. But even in our own shores, where we have already started to allocate blocks for extraction, we're going to see a lot of these things, because it's not only about the passages themselves, but it's also about the amount of traffic that is happening in between where things is being extracted and to where it's going to be consumed or changed into some other form of a product. So, for example, in our case, if we're looking in the shores of Mozambique, if there is more oil exploration and there's more gas exploration, whether it's liquefied or it's in the gaseous form, we will be seeing more and more accidents. And if you think of Mossel Bay, we've also seen our own versions of what has happened. But because there is more of these projects that are coming around, and there's going to be more shipping corridors within the shores of our continent, these things are going to happen a lot more. And we just have to make sure that the rules are there, and what is unnecessary should not be put there, and make sure that we're protecting our biodiversity and our ocean.
Mr. Khambule, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for giving us it's a very important view on this accident that happened in Mauritius. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's Greenpeace Africa's Happy Khambule talking to us about the ecological disaster really that's taken place off the coast of Mauritius. A ship struck a coral reef there, and hundreds of tons of oil spilled out. 17 dolphins have been counted amongst the animal life that's been damaged, but the cost goes way beyond that, even humans being affected by that accident. And Greenpeace Africa calling for stringent and more comprehensive sanctions on the way ships are able to travel in these safe zones, as they're called, safe channels.